always filled him with wonder. The air was chilly, and the autumn leaves crunched under his feet. David recalled his grandfather's words. "The village is full of hidden secrets, but the graveyard, oh, the graveyard, that's where secrets come alive." He reached his grandfather's grave and placed the flower he had brought with respect. Suddenly, an unusual sound caught his attention. It seemed to come from beneath the ground. David, driven by curiosity over caution, moved towards the sound. He came upon a freshly dug grave with no inscription yet. The sounds grew stronger, and David realized the earth around the grave was stirring. At that moment, a thick fog began to swirl around the graveyard. David, now feeling fear coursing through his veins, wanted to run, but his feet seemed glued to the ground. Suddenly, an indistinct shape emerged from the earth, with eyes glowing like red-hot coals. David, unable to flee, could only watch and wait to see what intentions this supernatural being had. David, with breaths trapped in his chest, stared at the indistinct shape that had emerged from the ground. The supernatural being, with heavy and slow steps, was approaching him. David could feel each step of the creature shaking the earth. The fog thickened, and David could no longer see anything but the creature's glowing red eyes. Suddenly, a voice like an ancient whisper wound its way into David's ears. It seemed to come from afar, yet at the same time, it was as if it was right next to him. The voice said, "David, you cannot escape us. You are part of this story." David, now feeling terror in his entire being, tried to scream, but no sound came from his throat. The supernatural being now stood close to David. David could feel its cold breath on his face. He wanted to run, to scream, to wake up from this nightmare. But it was as if he was trapped in a bad dream. The creature, with a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, said, "David, you must stay. You must finish our story." David, now knowing he couldn't escape, decided to confront the being. He said softly, "I don't know who you are, but I only came to visit my grandfather's grave." The creature, with a smile that faded into the fog, replied, "David, we have always been here, and you have always been a part of us." David, now standing face to face with the supernatural being, suddenly felt dizzy. The creature's voice continued to murmur in his ears. "David, you must stay. You must finish our story." But David could no longer focus. The world spun around him, and he felt himself falling to the ground. At that moment, other beings emerged from the fog. Creatures with eyes that shone like dark jewels, and hands that seemed to be made of night itself. They moved towards David quietly and enveloped him. David, now completely unconscious, was taken by them to a dark and unknown place. When David regained consciousness, he found himself in a dark, windowless room. There was no light except for a faint glow seeping through a crack in the wall. He tried to stand up, but realized his hands and feet were chained. A voice from the darkness said, "David, welcome to your new home." David, now knowing he couldn't escape, could only wait to see what fate awaited him. He knew this was just the beginning of his adventure in this supernatural world. David, now chained in the absolute darkness of an unknown room, heard whispers coming from afar. Voices that seemed to murmur from the old stone walls of the room. He pulled at the chains with all his might, but the more he struggled, the heavier and tighter the chains seemed to become. Suddenly the sound of heavy dragging footsteps approached from behind the door. The door opened with a grating noise, and a colossal creature entered, its eyes shining like two flames, its hands full of long, sharp thorns as if made of night itself. The creature approached David and said with a voice that seemed to rise from the depths of hell. "David, you have been chosen. You must be our sacrifice." David, now knowing he had to fight for his salvation, pulled at the chains with all his strength, and at that moment, something strange happened. The chains began to dissolve and David managed to free himself. He quickly fled the room and ran through the dark, winding corridors of a castle he had never seen before. The sound of the supernatural being's footsteps echoed behind him. David knew he had to escape this place at any cost. He reached a large window that was illuminated by the moonlight. Without hesitation, he ran towards the window and threw himself out with all his might. David was suspended in the air, and at that moment he felt a sense of freedom. He fell towards the ground, and just before he hit the ground, he felt hands catching him. When he opened his eyes, he found himself among a crowd of supernatural beings, looking at him with compassionate eyes. One of them, who seemed to be their leader, approached David and said, "David, you have passed our test. You have shown that you have a brave heart. We accept you as one of us." David, now realizing that everything had been a test, looked at the beings and said, "I'm ready to be with you and write my own story." And with these words, Davy and the supernatural beings walked towards the sunrise, and David knew that more adventures awaited him.